welcome everybody. I've been thinking over the last several sessions what to call these things. I was calling them e-learning career chats, and then I was going to do something different. I'm just calling it the eLearning Designers Academy Live on Wednesdays. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to today's session. Before I introduce our guest, Heidi Kirby, which I'm so excited to chat with, just a quick couple of housekeeping notes about how these sessions work. So these sessions are intentionally unstructured and unplanned. So Heidi and I, we've communicated over email like 2 or 3 times, but we haven't had any pre-conversation about what we're going to talk about today. So it's a totally unstructured conversation, and it'll go in any direction we happen to take it. The other thing I want you all to know, and if you've been to one of these sessions before, you already know this, but for those of you, if this is your first time, a big part of our time together is answering your questions. So you'll notice on the right-hand side, there's the chat panel, and up towards the top, there's a little question icon, and you can click on that and submit any questions you have for myself or for Heidi on anything. And once we're about halfway through and we're ready to tackle questions, we'll start tackling questions. And while you're there, you can upvote on other people's questions. So make sure to do that, because we'll be tackling the questions that get the most votes first. And we'll try to make our way through all of them. And I see some familiar names. Hey, Jacob. Hey, Paula. I'm sure we have some other people here that I recognize in the chat. Feel free to introduce yourself in chat. And without further ado, Heidi, welcome so much. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I was just saying to you a moment ago, so many of the people that I've invited to these sessions, folks like yourself and Amy from the other week, and Aaron Chancellor, who's going to be joining me in a few weeks. I feel like I know you all because I see your names and I see your content, and I see your faces. But this is the first time we've ever had a chance to chat. So so take a moment. I'd love for you to introduce yourself. What do you do for a living? And a good segue is I always love to know people's story about how they got into learning and development. And so feel free to share that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually got my career start as a college English professor. And so I had finished my undergrad degree in English, much to my parents' dismay, right? Mm-hmm. And finished my college degree in English and couldn't find a job other than working retail. And not wanting to work retail forever, which I'm sure, Tim, as a loss prevention background, you totally understand. Somebody said to me at one point, hey, if you go back to school and get your master's, you can teach college. And I was like, oh, really? That sounds good. So that's exactly what I did. And then I spent about 5 years just going around to different colleges in my region in Cleveland, Ohio, just teaching 2 classes at this school, 2 classes at this school. And once I found out that I was pregnant with my son, I was like, this is not sustainable, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's not, the schedule is not consistent. The money is not consistent. I need something a lot more consistent. And so when my son was 6 months old, I started my PhD program in instructional design, and very quickly kind of realized, hey, wait, I'm already doing a lot of this with the work that I do now. And so I took the summer to kind of dial back my class load and really try and make the transition. And people like yourself and Kara North and others who were, I think the TLDC was like just getting started. It wasn't even called that at the time. And, just those resources that were really helpful combined with my PhD program allowed me to kind of fill in those knowledge gaps and update my resume and things like that. And I was actually able to land a job as an instructional designer for NASA as my first ID job, right?
Cool
of all things. Yeah, right. Yeah. Your entry level ID job is with NASA, right? And so I worked with NASA for about a year, and then I worked for a major health insurance company and a tire distributor. I worked for a startup for a little bit. And then in this past year in January, I made the leap to becoming a manager of learning solutions. So now I have a small team. I have an instructional designer and a knowledge-based admin who help round out the team. And we are responsible for the L&D function for our small organization.
That's awesome. I have two questions then. So first off, let's go all the way back to your time in retail. For those of you who don't know, I used to work in retail. That's how I got into learning. I used to catch shoplifters. You kind of alluded to that. You mentioned that. Do you remember any fun shoplifter stories from your time in retail?
Oh, I just remember the one time that I had to be, so I worked at Old Navy for a while.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And I remember I had to be a witness, quote unquote. Like it was a male loss prevention associate, and there was like a young woman who was like probably 15 or 16 who had gotten accused of shoplifting. And so I had to like be present while he was like questioning her and waiting for her dad. And I just remember her dad showing up inebriated and screaming at her, and they were like, oh my God, what do we do? Like, I don't know if we can release her to her dad, like, because he's clearly drunk. And it was a hot mess. So
it is a hot mess. Yeah. So so that's very common, actually. Not the screaming inebriate, the drunk dad, but the having a witness. That was what when I was working in loss prevention, the store employees loved the most, is if they could come be the witness in the room. So if ever I was ever apprehending, that's the technical word, of a female shoplifter, we always had a witness in the room, for reasons that I'm sure you can imagine why. Yeah, I have tons of stories like that. Well, I have to do a session about like war stories about working in loss prevention. I think people are always amazed. Like statistically, like 1 in 12 people in a store is a shoplifter. And so you'd be amazed at how many shoplifters there are. Okay, so my second question for you, and this is unrelated to our topic, but it's something that as you were describing your experience, I'm curious to get your take on this. You know, one of the things I think has recently changed, not recently, but is changing in the job market, not just in our industry, but in general. Maybe it's a generational thing, I don't know. But, you know, as you described all of the different places you worked, you know, if you were to go back like 15 years ago, people would have called that job hopping, and there would have been stigma about it. And I'm similar. Like I typically would only stay at any particular employer 2.5, maybe 3 years before I move on to something new and different. And part of that's because I get bored really easily. Like I need more challenge. I need something different. And I'm curious to hear, do you feel like having all those different experiences from working with a startup and NASA and doing all of that, like how has that benefited your career? Because I think there's so much stigma about it, but I actually think it's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, I still get the stigma from others, especially my husband's been at his job for 16 years. So he's always like, you're going to like, he gets panicked, right? He's like, you're going to leave again. You're going to make a shift again. But now like, he's to the point where he's like, I trust you. Like, you know, do whatever you do. Right. But I think without especially the management that I've had, through those different positions, I've just had really, really great, amazing managers.
That's
and
awesome.
I think without meeting those mentors at those different points in my career, I definitely wouldn't be managing my own team today. And so it's given me a view of how different L&D departments function, about how different businesses are organized, you know, their org charts and structures. And then it's just given me the chance to work with, like, where I'm one of 2 instructional designers, where I'm the only instructional designer, where my best team I was on was where I was one of 7 instructional designers. And there was so much to learn, right? But for me, I found like the best way, unfortunately, to move up is to move out. And so a lot of times where I felt like, okay, I can't go much further here. It's time to move on.
I think that has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but I think that's a great career lesson, because I remember, I've told this story before, but when I used to work at Kohl's department stores in their learning department, I had a coworker who was just so adamant and desperate that she was going to get promoted in her role, and she deserved it, and she did deserve it. And it just wasn't happening, and it wasn't happening, and it wasn't happening. And I left Kohl's, a couple of years later, and it was like 10 years later, and I'm still friends with her. She was still in that same position 10 years later, waiting for that promotion. And I kept telling her, I'm like, I'll call her Susie. I was like, Susie, if you want to move up, you got to move out. And I totally 100% agree with that. You mentioned a lot of the reasons that I think moving around to different organizations, call it job hopping, whatever it might be, it creates a more well-rounded version of your skills, and you have so much more context to like pull from and learn from. And yes, you work with all sorts of different people and different leaders and good leaders and bad leaders, and you learn more about what you want for yourself and what you want out of an employer, or what you want to be as a manager, right? Yeah, I totally agree with that. So
yeah,
I wanted to ask about that.
yeah.
So, okay, so we're talking about today networking and finding mentorship in L&D. And you mentioned this a few moments ago as you were making your transition into instructional design and L&D. You mentioned folks like myself or Kara North or other people in the industry that you've learned from, or maybe received mentorship from, or networked with. Can you tell a little bit about like how specifically networking and mentorship has benefited your career? And then we'll talk a little bit about how to go, build your network or find mentors in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I'm sure many of you who are coming from teaching are kind of familiar with, this whole idea of like LinkedIn as a social network where you like make friends with strangers is super awkward at first, right? Like, is it okay to message a stranger? Is it okay to like add a stranger as a connection, right? And the answer is like, yes, of course it is. But it's a really hard thing to get over initially, right? And so, you'll be listening to someone's podcast or see an interview, and you have to like start slow, like, oh, hey, I saw your podcast and I'd love to be connected, right? But it was getting out of my comfort zone and doing that and doing it over and over, and starting to just have like informational interviews with people when I was first trying to change careers, that really helped me to build confidence and build skills. Mm-hmm. And so it was, I met with someone just for an informational interview, and she worked for a local company that helps a lot of instructional designs become consultants and consult with different projects. And still to this day, like one of their people from the company will reach out and be like, hey, are you looking to get into the freelance market? I've got a project if you're interested. And it just, I can't even describe the opportunities that come up that you have no clue, that you would never have known about otherwise. And it really wasn't until COVID, when I was laid off from my job, that I really shifted and started like building my personal brand. Right. Okay. I think part of it was like, I had spent so much time, like, pouring myself into whatever organization I was working at the time. And so when I was laid off, it really kind of hit me like, these organizations aren't giving anything back to me at the end of the day. Like, I need to build my own personal brand. And through working for the startup and, having always wanted to start my own podcast, right, for like years, and being able to leverage that as part of working for the startup of, hey, I'll give you an ad spot. We'll promote the startup, but we'll also create important content for L&D. And starting my podcast and realizing that like, now I'm a brand. It's intense, but it's a great way to build your network. And then it just becomes a matter of like connecting with all the other people who have the same ideas and thoughts as you, and then realizing, hey, wait, I actually know quite a bit about this and could maybe help other people who are new to it. And so then all of a sudden you find yourself, wait, I'm not the mentee anymore. I'm the mentor now. And now I get to help other people. So it's kind of come full circle in the last year for me.
Yeah, let me ask you this. One of the things you mentioned a moment ago was about how people reach out and they're like, they feel awkward. And I get the same thing when people will reach out the one that always kills me inside is when they'll reach out and they'll ask, like, I hope you don't mind if we connect. Or they like apologize. And I'm like, why are you apologizing? Or like people email me, I'm like, sorry to take up your time. And I'm like, you're just messaging me. If I don't have time for you, I'll probably be late in replying, but you don't need to apologize. So what is that stigma? Where does that come from?
That's a good question. I don't know. I feel like it comes from other social media.
Maybe, yeah.
And yeah, I agree with Betty, who said that you're a big deal. And so like, yeah, like
Hi,
for
Betty.
people who
I'm not a big deal. Thanks.
You know, but there's, like you said, like you've seen my photo, you've seen, and like I am not a big deal. Like I am not a big deal at all, but people act like that because they see my content or they've heard my podcast. And so now all of a sudden they think like, oh, I can't reach out to this person because they're whatever, a big deal, or that they have some sort of, you know, like that I have something that they don't, right? I have a podcast. You know, maybe that's something I have that you don't have, but you could have a podcast. Why not? Right.
Yeah.
And I think we also keep, I don't know about anybody else, but like I keep my Facebook and my Instagram super locked down, right? Like I don't add people unless I know them on those social media outlets. And I think that people get into that same mindset when they approach LinkedIn, but LinkedIn is a different type of social media. It's not that personal, you know, that same vibe. And so it's okay to like, especially if you're like your only instructional designer in your company, you need to have other people to talk to. You need to have, you know, that network, right?
Yep. Yeah, I think you bring up a good thing about like having a podcast and then people project, I don't know what the word that comes to mind, and I don't like this word, like I'll use a couple different words, like the celebrity status or this influencer status or whatever that is. And I've talked about this before when I've talked about speaking at conferences, about how when you go speak at a conference, or maybe when you have a podcast, or when you're doing a webinar like this, because you're the person on stage and they're not, people project some sort of idea that you're more credible or that you're whatever the case might be. And it's like, no, just because I have a fancy jacket on today at the conference and I'm talking about something, you know, it doesn't make me special or non-approachable or whatever the case might be. I don't know what that stigma is. Back when I first got into learning and development, I remember the culture of this company I was working at was that like if I posted something on LinkedIn or I updated my profile, it was like, oh gosh, are you leaving? Are you applying? And that's such an old mindset now. Like that's such a ridiculous mindset when you think about it. So I don't know if it comes from that. Like I've had people reach out and they feel like they have to be secretive about like reaching out to me or something like that. Or, you know, I don't know. Yeah.
I'm being active on LinkedIn. Is my boss going to think that I'm leaving? You know? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was talking to somebody the other day about this, and I said to them, because I asked them, they were talking about wanting to get into freelancing, and the question I always ask people who are currently working, wanting to get into freelancing, is I ask, well, does your boss know that you want to do this, and how would they react if they found out that you were working towards freelancing? And this one particular person had told me, oh yeah, my boss wouldn't react really well to this. And I'm like, well, that's probably a sign that you don't want to work for that person. So, you know, if your boss is going to get insecure because you're networking or connecting with people, you know, that's a sign that maybe you don't want to work for that person.
You might need a new boss.
Yeah. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about mentorship. You know, you could look at this from many different lenses, from people who are already working in this industry, just looking to connect and build their network or find mentors. Or we talked a little bit about this a moment ago, Heidi, right before we started. There's just a flood of current and former teachers wanting to get into this industry, and they might be completely brand new to LinkedIn or new to figuring out who they should connect with in this industry. And so I'm curious to get your perspective on, if you go back to when you were first getting into it and you're talking about like Kara North or whoever else you might be looking for mentorship from, like, how did you go about doing that? And what tips would you give people about finding and connecting with somebody who could potentially be a mentor?
Yeah, so I was actually really lucky in the sense that my first few managers, my first few direct managers at my different instructional design positions kind of served as my mentors.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when you're spending 40 hours a week with those people, they kind of naturally become your mentor. And so what I always tell people who are looking for kind of their first instructional design job is to kind of ask those questions early in the interview process, right? Like, who else am I going to be working with? Are there other instructional designers? Who's the hiring manager? Do they know about learning and development? Because if you're going to be the only instructional designer and you're like stuck under HR or something and assigned compliance training, then you're not going to have a lot of room to grow and learn in that position. So the position that you're going for should be like a great place to start to look for mentorship. But also, the group that I volunteer with, Teaching a Path to L&D, has been, it's wild. It started as like, hey, we're going to do a webinar series. Does anybody want to help? And I was like, yeah, sure. Let me help with this. And it has blown up into this huge thing. We have like a handful of mentors who offer their time to meet with people who are pursuing or even just thinking about pursuing the field. And we'll spend some time with you going over your resume, looking at your portfolio. And so that's less of a formal mentor relationship. I don't necessarily have time to spend like an hour every day with the same group of people, unfortunately.
Yep.
But it's definitely like, hey, sign up for a time slot. Let's go over stuff and then keep me posted on your progress, And so I've connected with a ton of different people. So that's like a less formal kind of support system. So there's a couple ways you can kind of do it. I don't know about how you've kind of done it. I'm interested to know that.
For me, I'm not a big fan of like really overly complicated, convoluted relationships or structures to anything. I'm one of those people that if I want to go learn from somebody, I'll send them a thoughtful message and I'll be like, hey, do you have 30 minutes? Let's hop on Zoom and let me pick your brain. And that's kind of what I want from people as well. If they want to get mentorship from me, one of the things I stopped doing actually, I say last year, but it was technically the year before, is I used to offer like paid one-on-one coaching. And I stopped doing that because there was this I kept feeling like there was this weird transactional thing where because there was an exchange of money for that time that I wasn't able to have an authentic conversation. It was mostly in my head, but I needed to let that go. And so for me, I can say from my perspective, like I will give my time to people if they take the time to say, hey, I'm reaching out. I want to pick your brain about this specific thing. Can I have 30 minutes of your time? And I'll gladly find the time to give it to them. And I think the most important thing that I think people get wrong about mentoring, a couple things. Kara North talks about this a lot, is that you shouldn't be paying for a mentor. It's one thing to pay for a coach, but you shouldn't be paying for a mentor, because a mentor is somebody who is offering their time to help you, but that mentor is probably also gaining from their time by helping you. So all the people I've mentored, I've gained as much as I've given to those people. But the other thing that I think that gets missed a lot of times is that really, for people looking for mentorship, really the heavy lifting is on the mentee, not the mentor. And so if you're looking for a mentor, have something specific that you want to accomplish with a specific person for a specific reason. Don't just randomly reach out to people and be like, hey, I like you. Can we talk? Well, okay, great. What about? You know what I mean?
Sure.
I don't know. Does that make any sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a good distinction between mentorship and coaching, is that typically, definition wise, I've always thought that mentor is kind of like a free, way less formal, and coaching is just more formal and maybe paid, right?
Right.
But I think it's really, I think what you said about reaching out to people with something specific and it being a mutually beneficial relationship is really true for me. Everyone I meet with is just so grateful and so gracious and is just like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for spending this time with me. And what they don't really realize is that like I said, I'm a new manager. So
Yep.
anything that I can do to help people with their career, help give them guidance, help listen better, become a more empathetic leader, that's helping me too.
Right. And you're right. And when people are new to this industry and you talk about it being mutually beneficial, I'm sure people think, well, what do I have to offer that person? You know what I mean? That's mentoring me. And I totally agree with you. I can't tell you how many times when I've talked to people, I go back to the freelancing example, when I talk to people about if they want to get into freelancing, me having this conversation with them and verbalizing my thoughts, my tips, what that's actually helping me do is figure out what I really feel about that topic so that maybe I can make content in the future about that topic, or,
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Or write a book or create a blog post or create a video like that. The act of talking that out with somebody helps me figure out, well, how do I really feel about this? And what do I really want to tell people about that thing, you know? And they
absolutely.
may not even realize they're offering that benefit, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So one final question I have for you, and I'm curious what your experience has been over the last year. So you mentioned you got laid off
Mhm.
at the start of the pandemic, or at some point during the pandemic. And one of the things that I found most interesting over the last year and a half or so is that, prior to the pandemic, for me personally, I was doing tons of traveling. I was speaking at tons of conferences and doing workshops. And I was on the road almost every single week in 2019. And then 2020 happened and it stopped, right? And what I found most interesting, though, about the pandemic is I've done more networking and I've made more connections with people being isolated in my home than I ever did when I was out and about and going. Has that been your experience, and or not? I'm curious.
Yeah, totally. So at work, whenever you do like those personality assessments, I always got
Hmm.
like the super extroverted things. And I found that I always spent all of my extroversion at work. So that by the time I got home, I didn't want to talk to anyone or do anything
That's so
because
true.
truly I really identify with this term ambivert, right?
Hmm.
It's kind of like a new term that people are using post COVID to describe like I'm not always an extrovert. Sometimes I'm introverted, and I that resonated with me so very much because like at work I'm on,
Hmm.
right? And working from home I didn't have to be. And so
Yeah.
now I get to save some of that, and so now I get to do that with people that I want to interact
Hmm.
with. Not that I don't want to interact with my coworkers, but like, let's be real, some more than others, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yes.
now I
That's
get to
me.
kind of pick and choose. And like I've said, like I've stopped doing things out of obligation.
Yeah.
So that's one big thing I've taken away from the pandemic is I've stopped socializing and networking with people that I felt obligated to and started just focusing on those relationships that I wanted to have and the
Yeah.
things that I wanted to do. So, and yeah, I met Betty during the pandemic. So,
That's awesome. I'm laughing because you said something that's so true. Is when I was managing a team. For anyone who's never managed somebody before, this is going to sound horrible, but if you've ever managed people, you'll get this. You just verbalize that emotion of like, "Ugh, do I have to have another one-on-one with this person?" You know what I mean? Yeah. Or meet
yes.
that stakeholder again. We that 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 resonates with me. Um, I was going to say something else, but it escaped me. You bring up a good point about working virtually. You do get to be more selective about who you choose to spend your time with and not. And I think that's helped me have more meaningful conversations with people. I think because if somebody reaches out, and I don't know if this ever happens to you, I'll have people reach out and they'll send like 2-word sentences of like, "Let's talk."
Yeah.
Well, okay, cool. I don't know if I'm going to invest 30 minutes in that because I don't know what I'm going to get with you, right? But
Sure.
but when people send a meaningful message, and you're right, when I used to work in manage a team and doing instructional design all day, when I came home at the end of the day, the last thing I wanted to do was write and blog about, talk about instructional design or be on for other people. Okay, good. Well, so let's get to some of the questions. We have some questions in the
Yeah.
questions pod. For those of you who maybe joined us a little late, you'll notice that above the chat panel, there's a little questions icon with a little question mark, and you can submit any questions you have for us, and then of course upvote on them. So I'm just gonna start at the top. Our first question comes from Jessica. Hey, Jessica. And Jessica wants to know, what are your thoughts on how to network, find mentors in person versus remotely? Pros versus cons. I'll start with this one, and then Heidi, I'm curious to know your thoughts on this. I actually think it's easier to network remotely because it's so much easier to send a message to somebody behind the keyboard rather than walking up to a complete stranger and trying to introduce yourself, and then there's that awkwardness, and you know what I mean. I don't know. I find it easier networking remotely because that interaction's a bit more controlled. I don't know. What's your thoughts on that, Heidi?
I'm laughing because I just remembered. So this was probably a handful of years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
But I forget, was it like an ATD mixer? It was something, right?
Yep.
There was a networking event at a restaurant. I drove around the parking lot, started to get a panic attack, and then went home and never went in. Never went in. So I have social anxiety, right?
Yep.
And so finding networking remotely has been the best thing in the whole world because I can be in the comfort of my own home and still build relationships and build connections with people and not have to worry about going somewhere. And like you said, that awkwardness of walking up to a person, that is just not, it is not in my nature to walk up to somebody and start talking to them. That's just not who I am. So I think that that's definitely it. The easiness of it is definitely a pro. I guess I would say that the con is if you are somebody who really does like that in-person interaction and meeting and going out places and just being kind of a social butterfly, then I could see where you'd prefer the in-person.
Yeah.
But also kind of the same thing I tell people with the job search, right? If you are looking for people to talk to regularly remotely, you're probably going to be in competition with a lot of other people who are searching for mentors remotely. Whereas if you're looking for somebody who lives close by, is in your same region, there's going to be a little bit less competition, much like the job search. So that's maybe another pro to kind of the in-person route.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've had similar. I haven't driven away from an event, but I've had similar panic attacks of, because it's exhausting to be on, for people. And you're right. When you get to be remote, I think you get to be more thoughtful about what you say to the person because you don't have to respond right away. And you're right. I think you get to be a more authentic version of yourself when you're networking remotely. That's what I'd say about that.
Absolutely.
Okay. So Betty, hey Betty. Betty has a great question. And let me record the answer here. This is a great question. We talked a little bit about this a moment ago, but Betty wants to know, can you discuss the differences between having a coach and having a mentor? I've struggled with trying to figure out how to define this, and I think it's an evolving definition for me. But Heidi, I don't know, what are your thoughts on coach versus mentor? What's the difference between those two?
So Betty said something really good in the chat. I'm trying to find it, where she thinks that as a coach, you have to kind of do the prep work and you drive the conversation. But when you're a mentor, you're more responding and the mentee is driving the relationship. And I really like that distinction. And not only do I like that distinction, but we also mentioned that mentorships are typically not paid, where coaches are more often paid relationships.
I love that. You're absolutely right. Yeah, coaching is more coach driven, mentee is more a mentorship is more mentee driven. And it goes back to the previous tip or the previous thing we're talking about before is that if you're looking for mentorship from somebody, be really specific about what it is that you're wanting to get from that person and build a relationship with that person. Yeah, I think that's, Betty, thank you. That's a great way of summing it up. I don't think I have anything else to add to that. Anything else to add to that one?
Thanks, Betty, for that one.
Betty. Yes, thanks. Okay, that answer is recorded. Okay.
Love it.
Paula asks a really great question. Hey, Paula. Paula wants to know, is a community of practice just as good or better than formal mentorship? Heidi, I know you're doing I forget the acronym, but the pathway to teaching, that's a community of practice in sorts, right?
Yes.
So can you talk about that and how it relates to formal mentorship?
Yeah. So with TPLD, I guess it would depend on your definition of formal mentorship, right?
Yeah.
So we do have like our Slack channel and like our LinkedIn group, which are very much communities of practice. But then we have like our office hours, which I feel like are more of that formal mentorship. I think they're really comparable. And I think that as the community of practice grows, there will be times where I'm trying to keep up with all the different posts and try to provide value and feedback, and people have already beaten me to it. So I think sometimes in communities of practice, it can be even better because you get that many more opinions, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're working with me one-on-one, you're going to get like the Heidi view of the world, right? Whereas if you're working with a whole community of practice, you're getting, it's kind of like that job hopping thing where you're getting kind of a more well-rounded experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a place for both. I think there's a time for private, formal mentorship. I think I'm stuck on the word formal because I don't think mentorship is formal. I like it to be just a relationship, you know, and so I think there's a time for mentorship, and I think there's a time for community of practice. In both instances, though, I think one of the things I've seen people struggle with is when they go to a community of practice or they go to find a mentor looking for somebody to hold their hand and go do this, do that. And that's not what you're going to get out of a community of practice or a mentorship, because it's more about you're doing the work and maybe you want to bounce ideas off of one another or share your work and get feedback or give feedback. It's more about a group of self-starters coming together and sharing what they're doing and learning from one another. And I think the same thing is true with mentorship. You have to be a self-starter to have a really good, thriving mentorship. You can't just be deferential to whoever that mentor is, right?
Sure. Yeah, of course.
Good. Okay. I hope that helps, Paula. Okay, Shane, it's taking a moment to load here. Give me one moment. Okay, so Shane wants to know, I've always been a department of one. I've been in that position before. I know, Heidi, you said you have as well. I feel like I've learned a ton through professional development opportunities, but without feedback from others, I haven't been able to level up. Any advice for getting feedback from seasoned L&D pros? Well, I'll jump off with this one, and then Heidi, I'm curious to know your thoughts. That's where I think a community of practice comes into play. So that's where, whether it's the community that Heidi participates in, or it's my community with the eLearning Designers Academy, or the Articulate community, or it's just going on LinkedIn and sharing what you're doing and getting feedback. That would be my opinion. I mean, a lot of my early education or development in this industry came from an enormous amount of time I spent on the Articulate community, doing things from participating in the challenges or answering other people's questions or putting my work out there. That's how I learned a lot of, how to level up my skills. Heidi, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, find your people, right?
Yes.
So initially that looks like a big community of practice like Tim's talking about, and there are a ton of free groups to join, right? So go find those people, and then within that group, find the rest of your people, find your smaller group of people. So go find that community of practice and say, hey, I am looking for other people who are using maybe this particular tool, this particular technique, working with this type of learner, whatever the case may be, right? Find that little niche group of people that are doing the same thing that you're doing and say, hey, who's willing to, meet with me weekly? Or there have been so many little subgroups that have come out of TPLD where I'll be talking to someone. They're like, oh yeah, I meet with this person and this person every week for accountability. Or, hey, this person and I teamed up for an instructional design project together to gain experience for our resume. And so within those groups, those larger groups, you can find your team, you can find your L&D team. And it doesn't have to be someone who's working at the same organization as you. And that's the best part about it.
Yeah, I just this morning, right before we got on today's call, I had a conversation with a woman named Allison Coulter, and I think she's part of the community. And she's been doing meetings with he's here, Jacob. I hope you don't mind
That's
me pointing
who I was talking. That's who I was referring to. Yeah.
And I was like, that's so fantastic, right? They're just it sounded familiar when you mentioned it. That's a great example of networking and putting yourself out there and finding your people. Oh gosh, what else was I going to say about this? I was going to say something that was probably going to transform Shane's life, but I forgot. Oh, I remember what it is. The other thing too is that, and I've said this before to people, is that the work you do 9 to 5 at work is not going to be the thing that develops your skills. Because most frequently the stuff we do at work is like boring stuff and it's not very innovative. And so spend every moment you can during your nights and weekends practicing your craft where you have complete creative freedom. Like I have a person in my academy program, her name's Leticia. She's developing her storyline skills by building a course on how to find a good tattoo artist. That's a really great way of getting outside your comfort zone and building something that you're passionate about and you can be as creative as you want to be. It's the same example. I've talked about this before. I have a course in my portfolio on how to cook a turkey. Well, I was never going to create a course at work on how to cook a turkey, but I had some time and I played around with storylines. So don't feel like your development or leveling up has to happen where you're working 9 to 5. It can happen outside of that. That's what I wanted to say.
Very true. Very true. And if you're a job hopper, you can keep that same L&D team that you found outside of your organization, even when you move on.
Yeah. Yes, I totally agree with that. I think we need to own job hopper. I think we need to get rid of the stigma and say it's, I don't know what to change it to, but I think a job hopper is not a bad thing. Okay, next question. Mohammed wants to know, as I was rewriting my teacher's resume today, and I feel that the experience section won't fit the job description of an instructional designer. Any tips? I'll let you start this one, Heidi. I have thoughts, but feel free to kick this one off.
Yeah. So first and foremost, I would recommend checking out the Teaching a Path to L&D YouTube channel, because not only is the founder of Teaching a Path to L&D a wonderful human being and one of my very good friends, but she is a resume wizard in a way that I am not. And she has a recorded webinar and a workshop that she's done on turning that teacher experience into a more corporate sounding, or using, the business terms and those kinds of things, because there are elements to your job as a teacher that translate, right? Do you design instruction? Do you create experiences for learners? Do you work with difficult people to try and improve performance, whether that be through an assessment or a lesson, or however? Do you have to get a number of things done within a certain time frame or within certain parameters? And so those are all transferable skills that teachers inherently have that can benefit them in ID.
Yeah. Yeah, I've talked about this before. It's about redefining your experience, right? And using the terms and phrases that resonate with corporate hiring managers, rather than lesson planning. Maybe it's curriculum design. They're really the same thing. It's just semantics, right? And so it's about redefining that experience and looking at those job descriptions and mimicking that terminology. I would agree with that. Good. All right. Let's do a couple more. Robert wants to know, I have moments of believing that I have the skills to transition into this is always, at this point during the webinar, my contacts go bad. So I don't know if it's the lighting or something. I have moments of believing that I have the skills to transition in a reasonable amount of time, fill in gaps, and be successful in this industry. Then I come across some people's work portfolios that make me think I will never work in this industry. How do you navigate through this emotional roller coaster of maintaining confidence through the process of pivoting careers? Robert, what you're experiencing is what we all experience, and that's called imposter syndrome. And I did a session with Betty on this a few weeks back, and no matter where you're at in your career, whether you are brand new or you've been somebody like me who's been working in it 10 years, that imposter syndrome is always going to exist. And I think part of, and there's a whole lot of things we can talk about overcoming imposter syndrome, but I think a big part of it, to your point, is acknowledging and realizing and coming to terms with the fact there's always going to be somebody better than you. There's always going to be somebody better than you, because they're on a different journey than you are relative to where you started and relative to where they started. And so one of the things I really liked that Betty said to me, even though this is not a session about Betty, but I'm going to keep calling Betty out. One of the things she said to me is, well, then celebrate that person where they're at, and celebrate where you're at. And then also just focus on you, focus on what you're doing, and focus on, and stop comparing yourself to others. There's this really great quote. I can't remember who said it. And I use it all the time, but if you spend all of your time, if you're running a race and you spend all your time looking back at the competition, you're going to lose that race. You need to focus on running your own race. So that's my soapbox on that. Heidi, I'm curious to know, how do you deal with this? How do you deal with imposter syndrome coming over that?
Yes, I talked to Betty as well.
Yeah.
Didn't we all, right? And
yeah.
I said in the chat, welcome to the club, right? But really for me, what helps me a lot is networking, right? And meeting more people, because here's the thing. There is no way in my life, even pursuing my PhD, even doing all the things that I do, people are like, when do you sleep? Because everything I do is like eat, sleep, and L&D, right?
Mm-hmm.
And still, there's no way I'm going to learn everything that there is to know about L&D. Never, ever. But by networking, it does a couple of things. It encourages the knowledge that I already have and reinforces that. But then it also lets me know who to go to for the different questions that I might have in the future. So I don't know a lot about AR, VR. Guess who does? Betty does. My friend Eamon does. And now I know I can reach out to the two of them whenever I have an AR, VR question. And so it builds that confidence twofold, right? Because you reinforce what you already kind of knew. You learn new things, and then you know who are the specialists in those different areas that you need to go to when you do have questions.
Yeah, I agree with that. The other thing I was going to say is, it's easy to, you stumble across somebody's portfolio or somebody on LinkedIn, and you look at what they're doing, or you think, oh gosh, their portfolio looks so much better than mine. And it's easy to get into a place of being paralyzed by that. And my advice to you would be, okay, great. They have a great looking portfolio. Take inspiration from it. What are they doing? How can I adapt that to what I'm doing so that you're continuing to grow rather than just being in a place of, paralyzation, if you will.
Yes.
Take inspiration from it, and celebrate it. And know that there's always going to be people better than you, and run your own race. That's what I'll say about that. Thank you, Robert. Hopefully that helps. Okay. We got about 10 more minutes. Let's do a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up here. Wendy wants to know, hey, Wendy. Wendy wants to know any good ideas on how to repay members or people for the time they've spent helping you. I recently bought a coffee gift card for an ATD member helping me. Is that enough? I struggle with this. Every time I've talked with Betty keeps coming up because Betty's the one who asks this. Every time I get on Zoom with Betty, she's like, "What can I do for you?" And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. Heidi, this is like asking people's love language. I have no idea. I like Starbucks, so coffee cards are always good, but I'm curious to know what you think.
Yes, I've received gifts that are above and beyond what I would. Any gift is above and beyond what I
Yeah.
would ask for. So, I've gotten Starbucks cards, I've gotten flowers, which was awesome, and those things are great. But what I care more about is like following your journey. So, like,
Yes.
when you get your job, when you get your dream job, when you land your role, when you do something awesome in L&D, I want to know about it. That's enough for me, is to see your success story and to know that I had some part of that or inspired you in some way. That's better than anything, really.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now that you mention that, yeah, the times that I've been most satisfied and happiest and fulfilled is when I give advice to somebody and then they do something with it, right? They actually take action and I get to observe them grow or be successful, not only because I gave them the advice, but because they're actually doing something with themselves and their careers. And so for me, yeah, the times I feel most fulfilled is not when somebody sent me cookies or one time somebody sent me marshmallows. They were really good marshmallows. They were like these really
Ooh,
nice marshmallows. But the times
nice.
that I feel most fulfilled is when somebody takes the time to send me an email and say, hey, I just want to thank you. This is what I did with the time you spent with me.
And
Yeah.
I can tell you that and I've met with over 30 people throughout the course of TPLD, and every single person has sent me a thank you. And my favorite part is when somebody lands a job or gets like double job offers and comes to me because they don't know what to do now or how to navigate a double job
Yes.
offer, which is awesome. And my
Yep.
favorite part is when they end up making more money than I make and they get like this really lucrative position. And I'm like, yes, like that to me is awesome.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. That's a good one. Okay, cool. Let's do one more and then we'll wrap up. I apologize in advance if I totally butcher your name. Yi Ting. We'll go with that. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Yi Ting wants to know, how can we create a mentoring space that is welcoming and helpful to women of color and instructional designers when the L&D field is predominantly white? That's a really great question. I think of people that come to mind as like Nyla Spooner with what she's doing with Design for Humanity or Design by Humanity. And so this is the advice that I'll give. And then Heidi, I'm curious to know your thoughts on this too, is that if you see something lacking or you see an opportunity, then you be the person to spark that change and create that opportunity. Don't wait for somebody else to do it. So if you see a gap or an opportunity, then be the person to do it. Maybe you're the person to do it because you noticed it. I don't know. Heidi, what do you think?
No, I agree with that. I think that not only is our field predominantly white, but it's predominantly women, like
Yep.
by a lot. As somebody who's about to start my dissertation research, I'm kind of nervous about the fact that I'm like planning on having equal numbers of male and female people to interview because there's not as many male instructional designers as there are white female instructional designers. And so I think that if you are responsible for building a community, keep that in mind. Keep in mind a welcoming space, not only for women of color, but for people with different sexual orientations or, just diversity in general, right? And think about that and really kind of, when you go to pick your mentors for that community of practice, pick from those groups. We do only have one guy, but we have a guy who is a mentor, and we have women of color who are mentors for TPLD. And that's something that we're really proud of because we do want that space to be welcoming for whatever, background you have, but also age too, because there are some people who want to make that career transition who are older and who are closer to retirement and who are worried just from that perspective of being that old and changing careers. And so there's a lot of different diverse people, and it's about welcoming all of them and creating a space where everyone feels comfortable.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. I was just thinking about this the other day. I was looking through my list of these sessions I've done, and it's been predominantly women. And I'm like, oh gosh, you're absolutely right. There are a ton of women in this industry, and that's a great thing. And when it is leaning one way or the other, you have to take the extra effort to be intentional with all the different types of diversity that you might include in whatever case might be. So. Good. All right. So before we wrap up and before Heidi, I give you a few moments to tell people where they can find you. A couple things I'm going to put in chat. So first things first, feel free to join our free community, the eLearning Designers community. It's a small, little niche community of people. Some people looking to transition to e-learning, some people wanting to build their skills in e-learning. I'm putting the link to that in chat, but it's operating really slowly. So it's community.elearningacademy.io. And then our next career chat will be, I believe, next week with Deanna Furlong. We're going to be talking about getting out of corporate America. There's so many people wanting to get into corporate America, but there's also a lot to be learned about getting out of corporate America and maybe finding your own way. And then the final thing is our next cohort for the eLearning Designers Academy actually opens next Tuesday. So feel free to check that out. I don't know if those things are showing up in chat. They all say they're loading for me. So if not,
They go.
There they go.
Wow.
It was just being slow. All right, Heidi. Well, the hour went by so quick. Thank you so much for joining. Where can people find you, connect with you, network with you, all of that good stuff?
I will paste my LinkedIn in the chat. From my LinkedIn, you can find the podcast that I host, the Block Building, Learning, and Organizational Culture podcast. You can find some of the other podcasts that I like to listen to. You can find the TPLD group. And you can find all of our TPLD resources at teachlearndev.org. I believe Erin Chancellor, who is a wonderful volunteer with our org, has also shared those links throughout to YouTube and Slack and everything else. But yeah, that's
good.
That's the best way. Find me on LinkedIn, connect, and don't worry about feeling awkward about it if I don't know you.
Yeah, it's okay. Well, fantastic. Well, thanks again for joining me, Heidi. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your week. Bye.